Everybody knows, of course, that our Torah mentions the keeping of Shabbat very many times, probably more than almost any other commandment except the prohibition of worshipping idols. Of course, idolatry is one of the worst sins in the Torah and is mentioned numerous times. But the one other commandment that's mentioned in every book of Torah numerous times, and then in the later books of Tanakh constantly, that's the commandment of keeping Shabbat. And in terms of the specific laws of what's forbidden on Shabbat, it's not so clear from the written Torah. At most, there are a few of what we call works, mlacha, the types of work that are forbidden on Shabbat. Only a few are explicitly mentioned. For instance, in one place it says not to burn fire, not to kindle fire. In one place it may be hinting to the idea of not carrying outside in Parshat Beshalach, according to some opinions. There is also a statement in one place that says Becharishu b'katzir tishbot, which may be translated. There are a few different possibilities, but at least one of the translations is you're supposed to rest on Shabbat from working on the land, from gathering the crop or plowing the land. So there are a few types of mlacha that are mentioned explicitly, but not a lot. And even about the ones that are mentioned, some of them, there are a few different interpretations what it really means. The last verse, for instance, may actually be talking about the Shemitah year, the seventh year when the land rests, and it's not talking about regular Shabbat, possibly. Whatever the case may be, of course, our sages learn the specific, what's called 39 types of work, from what was done when the Mishkan was built. When the tabernacle was built in the desert, we were stopping all the building during Shabbat time, and we learn from this that even when there is a mitzvah to build the Mishkan as soon as possible, we still had to rest on Shabbat, since the Torah puts the two commandments together. Even though the commandment of building of the Mishkan was one of the first things Moshe mentioned after he came down from Mount Sinai, but he also said before that we should keep Shabbat. So Shabbat is more important, and therefore all the works that were done in the Mishkan are forbidden to be done on Shabbat. But what's interesting is in our Parsha, there may be a hint, at least according to some opinions, about a different mitzvah with regards to Shabbat, what's called Techumim. Most sages say that the whole mitzvah is only rabbinical in nature. But there were some of our sages in the times of the Mishnah and Talmud that thought that Techumim are deoraita, that they are a commandment from the Torah. Now, we have to remember that there are a lot of commandments that are rabbinical in nature that are still hinted in the Torah. That's also a possibility. There are sometimes cases when the Torah kind of gives it in the hands of the rabbis to decide the exact parameters of certain mitzvot. With regards to Techumim, we rule, according to most Rishonim, that the whole commandment is only rabbinical in nature. But there are some sages who say that at least the Techumim of what's called 12 mil, which is about 9 maybe miles or a little bit less, there are certain Techumim that might be on the level of the Torah. But the sages who thought that it's a biblical commandment not to walk outside the city for even just 1 mil, about 1 kilometer, they learn it from our Parsha. How do they learn it? As I said, for us it's a rabbinical commandment, but it doesn't matter. This is, by the way, a very complex law. Whether it's rabbinical or biblical, we have to keep it, and it does apply to us today when we go to the country and other places, as I'll explain in a moment. So, where in the Torah does it say that there is such a thing as Techumim? Well, actually, the commandment itself might be hinted in a different Parsha, in Parshat Beshalach, the one I just mentioned, that it may be hinting to the prohibition of carrying something outside, but maybe actually telling people that they cannot even walk further than a certain distance from their town. Meaning the law of Techumim is not similar to other types of mlacha. Mlacha is when a person does something, usually with his hands. Techumim is just walking. So the prohibition of Techumim is not as strict, even if it's a biblical prohibition according to those opinions that it's deraita. There is still no strict punishment the same way as the punishment of breaking Shabbat in the Torah is very, very strict. So it's not really a mlacha, but it's forbidden to walk outside of the city for a certain distance. And if it's a rabbinical prohibition, then it's a rabbinical prohibition, but maybe hinted in the Torah. Whatever the case may be, the prohibition is to walk outside for too far. It's not the right thing to do on Shabbat to travel long distances, even if the person doesn't do any work, just walks. But the question is, how far is the Techumim? So that may be hinted in our Parsha, and that's how Rabbi Akiva learns it. In the Mishnah, that is, in our Parsha, it talks about Levitical cities, of course. The Levites, they were mostly busy with spiritual commandments and teaching Torah to the Jewish people, right? Like the brocha of the tribe of Levi before Moshe dies is Yaru mishpatecha leYaakov. They'll teach the Hashem's commandments to Yaakov, to the Jewish people. So mostly the Levites were supported by the fact that they were given certain amount of crops, the Massei, and they would be able to learn and teach Torah and do other services of the community. Something like what the rabbinical position is today. Until recently, every town where the Jews lived used to have a rabbi. Now also to a large extent it's true, but it works a little bit differently today. But it used to be that there was a town rabbi who was appointed, and he would do everything that's needed for the community, including marriages, divorces, if chas v'shalom people are divorcing. To write a get is a very complex procedure. Certain cases of monetary disputes may have been decided by rabbis. Sometimes rabbis help check mezuzah, tefillin. In general, tell people how to behave. And this is very important, of course. People have all kinds of halachic shilos, what's called shailot, questions of halacha, questions of Jewish law that they ask to the rabbi. That's why one of the very important part of a Jewish shelf in any synagogue, in any Beit Midrash, is what's called responset, shailot v'tshuvot, questions and answers. Rabbis asked all kinds of questions on kashrut, on Shabbat, and all kinds of other laws, prayer. So what was done by the rabbis in a later time was done by Levites mostly in the earlier time. And they used to have cities. Most Jews were living in villages and used to own land, and the Levites had these Levitical cities. So one of the things that the Torah tells us here is the kind of gvul, a kind of border area near the city that's also given to the Levites, meaning it's not just the city. The cities used to be generally walled cities, but also outside of the wall, a certain area is still considered part of that city. It's still shayach, what's called. It's still attributed to, and it belongs to the city itself. And there are two numbers mentioned here: 1,000 amot and 2,000 amot. Now, an amma is generally considered the distance between the elbow and the middle finger. So it's about half a meter, a little bit less than 2 feet. That's one amma. So 1,000 amot would come out to be about half a kilometer. Right? 1 kilometer is 1,000 meters. So 1,000 half meters would be something like half a kilometer, or maybe a third of a mile or something, less than a third of a mile. And 2,000 amot is 1 mil, 1 kilometer approximately, maybe 2/3 of a mile. So why does the Torah tell you two different numbers? So there are all kinds of explanations that the sages give to these two numbers, 1,000 amot and 2,000 amot. But the opinion of Rabbi Akiva is that's why it's hinted that the going out of the city, whatever is domain of the city, is 2,000 amot. So going further than that is forbidden because that's already outside of Techum. Techum is the term used for the border outside the city, out of which you cannot walk. So generally, I personally live in New York, and generally most Jews live in city communities, in larger cities, and very rarely do these laws apply, except if you walk really far to a completely different borough. There was a discussion at some point between different rabbis in America, in New York, whether you're allowed to walk on Shabbat, let's say to visit somebody in a hospital in Manhattan, when you live in Williamsburg in Brooklyn. So whether Brooklyn and Manhattan are considered one Techum. And it has to do with very complex technical laws from the Talmud in Massei Eruvin. That's the Talmudic tractate that deals with these types of laws. It's very complex when something is considered one city, when it's not. But generally, all of Brooklyn can be assumed to be one city, and generally, large cities, the apartments there, the houses are close enough to each other. It's all considered one city. So mostly, when we live in a place like Brooklyn, it's very rare that we have to ask a question: what's considered one Techum? So we could walk for 2 or 3 hours if you want to walk to a friend on Shabbat for 2 or 3 hours. Usually, it's permitted within Brooklyn. And according to some opinions, even to Manhattan, as I mentioned, there was a big dispute, and based on a number of factors, what connects Manhattan to Brooklyn. But with regards to out-of-town communities, and in particular in the summer, a lot of people go to Catskills and other places where there are like little bungalow colonies. There, as the Techumim apply full force, and that's why they usually have advertisers in the synagogues there to show this is how far you could walk. The rabbis there measured and checked what's considered one town, right? One town, maybe just one bungalow colony in certain cases, and the next one is already a different town. So you might not be able to walk for 20 minutes in some direction because that's already outside of Techum. Let's say you want to go to a synagogue in a different town, in a different bungalow colony, sometimes it may be a problem. So that's the issue that people, the Jewish people, Orthodox Jews, are careful about when we end up in places outside the city. And it may be that this is hinted, this Techum of about 1 kilometer is hinted in our Parsha. And as I said, we rule that this is only rabbinical law, but still, of course, rabbinical laws are kept just as carefully and with detail as biblical laws. For all of us, these are very important laws, and they have to be kept, and we have to know the laws. It's one of the most complicated topics, the laws of Techumim. Another case where these types of questions sometimes arise is if a person was traveling on, let's say, a train or a bus between city buses, and Shabbat started. So one question is, are you allowed to stay on the train on which you're already traveling? In many cases, you are permitted to stay. Even though Shabbat already started, the person who already got stuck like that, he may be able to stay on the train. The problem is that once he arrives to his town and he goes down on the station, he might not be able to travel anymore and walk even to his house, possibly. He might be actually stuck. Of course, not a good situation to be stuck like that, but that's the law. And it depends on a number of factors. Actually, a town that has an Eruv, which is all considered as if it's within one wall, then the rule is different. If he ended up being within that wall, within that Eruv area, he may be able to walk to his house. Anyway, so all these laws are very complex, and Techumim laws in general can be studied for years. I just wanted to mention the general idea. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.